Let me begin by having a brief review of where we've been, my own analysis of what's brought us here and where we're headed. Let me just start by saying I believe TARP and stimulus were critically important to averting a global financial collapse. I was in the room when the Secretary of the Treasury in the Bush administration and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve told us that if we did not act on TARP, that there could be a global financial collapse in days. Those are the words they used to us. They minced no words with us. They were as clear and compelling as they could have been. So the TARP was put in place, and let me just put up a first chart that shows what I think is the very clear evidence that TARP was effective. This chart shows the TED spread, the difference between what the government can borrow for and what the private sector can borrow for. And during the height of the crisis, the TED spread was 9 times normal. You can see at the peak. When TARP was put in place, it came back very markedly to more normal levels, and only now has really gotten back to its historic relationship. Again, the TED spread is the difference between what the private sector can borrow for and what the public sector can borrow for. And we have seen a normalization in the TED spread. In fact, one of the tip-offs that we had that we were headed for trouble in 2008 was we saw erratic behavior in the TED spread in the year before. Let me go to the next chart if we can. Economic growth. We had a negative 6.8% in 2008, the fourth quarter. We now see that economic growth has resumed. In the fourth quarter of 2010, we saw positive growth of 3.2%. And we have now had 6 consecutive quarters of growth. And we see the same evidentiary pattern in the private sector job growth. I think we all recall in January of 2009, the economy was losing more than 800,000 private sector jobs a month. In December 2010, the last month we have data for, the economy gained 113,000 private sector jobs. Now, we have now had 12 consecutive months of private sector job growth. Third, we've also seen a dramatic rebound in the stock market. After falling to a low of 6,500 in March of 2009, the Dow has now risen back up well above 11,000, in fact, approaching 12,000. 2 highly respected economists, Dr. Alan Blinder, the former Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve, and Mark Zandi, who was an advisor to the McCain campaign, completed a study last summer that measured the impact of federal actions, including TARP and stimulus, including both the Fed's monetary policy actions and the fiscal policy actions by Congress and the administration. Here is a quote from their report. We find that its effects on real GDP, jobs, and inflation are huge and probably averted what could have been called Great Depression 2.0. When all is said and done, the financial and fiscal policies will have cost taxpayers a substantial sum, but not nearly as much as most had feared, and not nearly as much as if policymakers had not acted at all. If the comprehensive policy responses saved the economy from another depression, as we estimate, they were well worth their cost. The next chart shows that Dr. Blinder and Dr. Zandi's estimate of the number of jobs we would have had without the federal response. It shows we would have 8.1 million fewer jobs in the second quarter of 2010 if we had not had the federal response, specifically the TARP and the stimulus. A similar story can be told by studying the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate averaged 9.7% in the second quarter of last year. According to Dr. Blinder and Dr. Zandi, if we had not had the federal response, the unemployment rate would have been 15% in the second quarter and would have continued rising to 16% in the fourth quarter of 2010. There is no question that the unemployment rate has remained stubbornly high. Just a little over a year ago, 3 years ago, it stood at 5%. It nearly doubled within a year's time and has fluctuated in the 9% plus range ever since. Last week, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office issued its budget and economic outlook, projecting the unemployment rate will fall only slightly to 9.2% by the fourth quarter of this year and fall farther to 8.2% by the fourth quarter of 2012. And the economy is growing at a much slower pace when compared to past recoveries. When measured against the 9 previous recoveries over the past 60 years, we see the current recovery lags considerably the 9 previous recoveries. Why is that? I believe it's because so much damage was done to the fiscal and financial system in this downturn. If you look at the previous recoveries since World War II, some of them have been relatively sharp, but none have seen the damage to the financial system done in this downturn. And so that dramatically affected the credit markets, and that dramatically affected business. And that obviously affects economic growth and economic activity. You know, I will never forget when Ms. Romer put out her forecast that we'd see 8% unemployment. And I told the White House at the time and told anybody listening that they could throw that forecast right out the window, because that forecast was based on the last 9 recoveries since World War II. And there was no basis for a comparison because there was not the damage to the financial system in the previous recoveries as we experienced in this one. And so I thought it was a forecast that had no merit. But we are now at a critical juncture. We've been borrowing about 40 cents of every dollar that we spend. That is clearly not sustainable. Spending is at its highest level as a share of the economy in 60 years. Revenue is at its lowest level as a share of the economy in 60 years. It seems to me readily apparent we've got to work on both sides of the equation. Gross federal debt is already expected to reach 100% of gross domestic product this year, well above the 90% threshold that many economists see as the danger zone. Let me just recommend to my colleagues the work that has been done by 2 of our most distinguished economists. Carmen Reinhart was the lead author of the book reviewing 800 years of financial crisis. In her work and the work of Professor Rogoff at Harvard, they concluded that when countries reach a gross debt of 90% of GDP, they see future economic growth reduced substantially. And we are at 90% gross debt to GDP. Now, one thing I want to be clear on is in the press, typically you don't read about gross debt. You read about the publicly held debt. Publicly held debt is about 30 percentage points lower than the gross debt. So our publicly held debt today is in the 60 percentage percentile range, but the gross debt is over 90 and will be at 100 by the end of this year. And again, the work that was done by Carmen Reinhart, University of Maryland, Dr. Rogoff at Harvard, concluded that when your gross debt reaches 90%, you see future economic growth impaired, and impaired in such a way that it translates into 1 million fewer jobs. That, at the end of the day, I think is what we must keep in mind. I believe that the deficit and debt reduction plan assembled by the President's Fiscal Commission, on which I served, got it about right. The plan would stabilize the debt by 2014, lower it to 60% of GDP. Let me emphasize that is on a publicly held debt measure by 2023, and roughly 30% by 2040. So publicly held debt would first be stabilized, then be brought back from the brink, and over time work down to what most economists say is a far more sustainable level. There were 18 members on the Commission. 11 supported the report. 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent. That's 60% of the commissioners supported the conclusions of the report that would reduce the debt by $4 trillion over the next 10 years. I believe that proved that Democrats and Republicans can join forces when we face an imminent threat to this country, and I believe this debt threat is an imminent threat to the nation. We can put together a credible, responsible, realistic, bipartisan budget plan. And this year, we need to finish the job. It will require presidential leadership, and it will require a Congress that is willing on both sides to come together to do things both of us would prefer not to have to do. I hope very much we face up to this, because a failure to do so would mean very serious consequences for the country in the future.